Hello, listeners. This is Kat, and welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfics. This will be the continuation of Verdant Revolution. This will be Part 7, Chapter 6, entitled From Outside the Storm. It wasn't long before the crowd started gathering around the deli, be it from the excitement of something happening in the sleepy suburb of Musutafu, or that the area was now being barricaded by police and first responders. The shattered glass of the doorway was spread across the ground inside the deli, as if an explosion had forced the doors off their hinges inwards. Jiro sat anxiously in one of the chairs to the side while the paramedics argued with Izuku. Her parents had been allowed to come out of the store and wait for the police to take Kyoka's statement with her. "I'm telling you, I do not need to go to the hospital. The bullet skimmed the lateral head at most. Put a few stitches in my arm and I'll heal fine as long as I keep it disinfected." Izuku had been having this argument for a few minutes now, and his patients had already been wearing thin before the paramedics' over-enthusiastic treatment of his flesh wound. Izuku had managed to keep Death Arms in his line of sight since the robbery ended. First, he had been giving his report to the first on the scene, so at least he had done part of his job. But then, directly after he got done shoving the poor robber into the back of the police cruiser, he had immediately gone over to talk with the media, who had managed to come crawling out of the woodwork at the mention of a villain attack. The paramedic finally relented. "Fine. You just want stitches and not any of the dozen healing quirks that could help you along? Fine. I'll leave it at that and let the police have you." The first responder, who had become just as aggravated with Izuku as Izuku had with him, signaled to the waiting officers before storming off with the signed release forms. Izuku took in the two men that were approaching Izuku's little group in detail. If Izuku wanted to get his story across, and help the man who'd had the chance to stand down stripped from him, then he'd have to play this carefully. One was a lean man that clearly had some form of cat quirk in him. He was lithe with yellow eyes and for the most part, body of a ginger tabby cat. Beside him was a tall man that was about as plain as they came. He, like his partner, wore a tan overcoat and matching hat that made the two look like they would have come from some noir film, were it not, of course, for the furry ears poking through the hat of the cat. "Hello there," the plain man spoke first when the two stepped up in front of Izuku and company. "I'm Detective Tsukauchi Namasa. This is my partner, Detective Tamakawa Sansa. I was told you were the witness to the villain attack. Also, be aware that anything you say I can verify as true with my quirk." Izuku quirked his eyebrow at the detectives. "You have a lie detector quirk?" Izuku asked, curious. It would certainly be useful in his profession. "Indeed I do. I always inform victims of attacks. It helps to make them believe we'll take what they tell us seriously." Tsukauchi nodded his head at Izuku's question. "I'll be needing to get statements from both you, Mr. Midoriya, as well as Miss Jiro." Izuku smiled, because for the first time during all of this, something was going very right. "That makes this easy then, Detective." Izuku's smile turned sharp with just a hint of his underlying rage seeping through into it. "Let me be the first to inform you, at the scene of this villain attack, that the man was not a villain at all. Quite to the contrary, I saw a man scared for his family, driven to commit a crime by desperation, and not ill will. Despite," Izuku practically spit the word, "the complete opposite being told to the media right now." Izuku jerked his thumb at Death Arms standing in front of a news camera, and allowed the smile now to drop off his face and the disdain to come through. "In fact, the only damage that was incurred during this attack was inflicted by Death Arms slamming himself through the door." Izuku gestured stiffly to the shattered remains of the front entrance to the deli. "Or by the man's handgun." Izuku gestured to the bullet wound in his right arm. "Which would have never gone off if the supposed hero in this situation hadn't punched the scared, anxious man who was about to surrender his weapon to me." Both detectives had stiffened during Izuku's recounting of the events, and Detective Tamakawa looked to his partner for verification regarding Izuku's statement. "Everything he said is true so far. What do you mean he was about to surrender his weapon to you, Mr. Midoriya?" Namasa asked him this follow-up. A knot was forming in his stomach, as was the feeling that this was about to turn into a massive headache. Jiro spoke up at this before Izuku could respond. "Of course everything he said is true. He managed to almost talk down an armed gunman, and he would have without the interference from Death Arms over there. Even then, if Izuku hadn't acted how he did, Jiro cut off and shuddered slightly, wrapping her arms around herself. It was just catching up to her that she had almost died back there. She had begun to shake, and her breathing was becoming hitched. Her parents gave her a worried look, but before either of them could do anything, a hand was placed on her shoulder, and she could hear a soft voice calling her name. When she looked up, she found herself staring into the deep emerald eyes of the man that had literally taken a bullet for her. "Hey there, Jiro. Focus on me now. What you are feeling is scary, but it is not dangerous. You're all right. You're here with your parents. There is nothing that is going to hurt you anymore. Focus on breathing. 1, 2, 3. There you go. Deep breaths." Izuku looked away from Jiro, away from where he was now kneeling in front of her, helping the poor girl through a panic attack, and into the two detectives' eyes. "I do think that you can get her statement later, yes? You can allow her parents to take her inside their shop here. She only came in at the end, and I can explain what happened from my perspective, which should be more than enough for the moment, yes?" Izuku's voice was still soft and calm, but there was a bite to it now, a threat for the detectives that there would be hell to pay if they didn't go along with his very reasonable request. "Yes, that is fine," Detective Tamakawa said as Tsukauchi nodded along with his partner. "You're free to go, Miss Jiro." Jiro's father helped his daughter back into the shop before anything else could happen, but her mother waited for a moment and approached Izuku instead before folding herself into a bow. "Thank you so much. Thank you for saving our daughter. Please, come back tomorrow or the next time you get a chance. I'm sure Kyoko will want to thank you herself, as well as my husband." Izuku gave her a smile before telling her not to bow. "I didn't do anything special, ma'am. I couldn't have lived with myself if I let her get hurt, after all." Miss Jiro gave him a concerned look before Izuku turned back to the detectives. When he did so, he stood at parade arrest, the soft, caring expression he'd used with Jiro melting away, like the spring snow. "Yes, sir. As I said, the man was about to hand over his weapon when Death Arms ruined everything. I had been negotiating with him for several minutes to de-escalate. He was just about to surrender and hand over his weapon when Death Arms came crashing through the door, spooking the man into raising his weapon again. Unfortunately, he also decided the correct course of action would be to punch the man holding a deadly weapon at an innocent civilian, which, of course..." Izuku was cut off when Naomasa sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Caused the weapon to go off when the man clenched from the impact, resulting in you saving Miss Jiro from the bullet, and Death Arms nearly killing an innocent civilian." He had been right. It was about to turn into a massive headache. "I'm going to need you to come back to the station with me, please, Mr. Midoriya. If he was willing to surrender to you, then he's more likely to open up to you than to me or my partner. You already have the rapport established with him." "I'll be honest with you, Detective. I thought I was going to have to fight you on this matter. I still think that the man is a criminal, don't get me wrong. He broke the law, but he certainly is not a villain. But I wasn't quite certain that you were going to see things the same way, considering, well..." Izuku didn't need to gesture this time for the two detectives to understand what Izuku was getting at. "Yes, well, I'm afraid, had I not heard your side of the story, I may very well have let this slide, as what it appeared to be on the surface. However, neither of us are in the business of overcharging criminals either. Come on, we'll head over to the station now and you can give us the full briefing on the negotiation on the way there. Then we'll go from there." Naomasa stopped and realized what he had just said. He was talking to a civilian. Why was he acting like Midoriya was one of his men? Before he could say anything, Izuku nodded with a "yes, sir," picked up his things, and began to make his way to the two detectives' vehicle. Naomasa was only able to stare at his back, confused for a moment, before following him to the vehicle. It wasn't even half an hour later that Izuku was sitting in the office of Detective Tsukauchi Naomasa, thinking that no matter what world it was, people were fucked up. The detective had left Izuku in his office to go convince the prosecutor to hold off, that the case wasn't quite as cut and dry as it seemed. Meanwhile, Izuku was left to wait in the detective's office. As Izuku was waiting for the detective, two things happened. The first was that his mother had caught news of the villain attack as well as his involvement in it. The panicking woman had taken a few minutes to calm down, to assure that he was fine and would be returning home as soon as he was no longer needed at the police station. The second was that the case board set up in the corner caught his attention. A series of photos were pinned across it. Different scenes, different victims, different methods of execution. The only thing that was readily apparent that linked the three cases was that all three victims were professional heroes. But there was something there. It was perplexing because Izuku was sure of it. When Naomasa returned to his office only a few minutes later, he found Izuku standing in front of his case board with a face of dread. Those 3 cases have all occurred within the last month. We're working on tracking down leads, but for the most part, they've gone cold. There just isn't anything that seems to point to the killer, except for all 3 victims being heroes, and, in that case, there could be any number of people that could want to target them. Izuku turned slowly, looking Naomasa directly in the eyes when doing so. 3 cases. That's your first problem. This was all done by the same person or group. This is one singular case with multiple victims. Naomasa was about to dismiss Izuku's words when his quirk told him that Izuku was telling the truth. He, at the very least, believed what he was saying, and going with his gut, Naomasa asked him why he thought so. Izuku pointed to the board. Everything lines up. First of all 3 were killed in sequential weeks from each other, each exactly a week apart. While that could be a coincidence, the other little details say otherwise. Each one was taken down with a different weapon in an isolated location, and each has small cuts and scrapes on them which would indicate each was in a struggle of some kind before their death. That in and of itself isn't surprising, especially in the case of a hero fatality. Where it starts to get suspicious, however, is here. Izuku pointed to each of the coroner reports and their lab results. You have 3 separate coroners for different parts of the city, sending you lab results where each victim has incredibly high counts of calcium cation ions in their sarcoplasm. Izuku looked back to where Naomasa stood, with a puzzled expression on his face. This means that before their deaths, each of the victims' bodies would have completely tensed up to the point of their muscles practically locking them in place. They would be effectively paralyzed until their bodies stopped signaling and their sarcolemma and T-tubules repolarized. Izuku let those words sink in, and could see the realization dawning on Naomasa's face as it gained the same serious look Izuku's had. What you're telling me is that all 3 victims, while being killed by different methods, were effectively all paralyzed before their deaths. Naomasa calmly asked his question of Izuku, even if his mind was racing with the implications. That is indeed what I am saying, and it doesn't stop there. Each of these heroes had come up with controversy of some kind in the weeks leading up to their deaths. Izuku began to point to each in turn. Bright Shadow recently had a report come out regarding the number of civilians blinded by their quirk when they used it on villains. Night Owl was recently criticized for his seeming inability to bring in criminals without maiming them with his talons, and finally, Thornhead here was recently mobbed by a group of civilians and was startled. This wouldn't have been a major incident worth mentioning if, in his surprise, he hadn't shot his spines into half a dozen civilians, injuring them. What you have is someone or someones targeting heroes because they aren't up to standard. In the case of an organization, maybe they've come up with some kind of chemical cocktail to do this, or in the case of an individual, maybe a quirk that can somehow broadcast a signal to their victims' bodies. Regardless of how and why, whoever is doing this is incredibly dangerous and knows what they're doing. Naomasa plopped down into his desk seat with a bone-weary sigh. Shit. That isn't good. All right, I'll have to verify what you just told me regarding the paralysis, but if that checks out, it's all sound logic, and a damn good theory, if not an ugly one. Naomasa looked up at Izuku from where he had his face in his hands. I don't suppose you'd be interested in an analyst position with us. I've been staring at that board for a week, and you just managed to link those 3 cases together in under 45 minutes. Izuku shook his head at Naomasa. Sorry, sir. I'm almost out of high school, and while it is true that I would have more time during my degree programs, I am also working on several technologies to aid me in getting into a hero program. If you could use my help, I have no problem working as a civilian consultant occasionally, but I simply don't have the time to commit to a full-time position as an analyst. Just my luck. I find a damn good analyst, and he's already set on his path. Oh well, just the offer of occasional help if we need it is better than I was expecting to get. I'll deal with this issue later. Come on, we have an interview to do. Detective Tsukauchi, entering interview with civilian witness Midoriya Izuku. The detective recited the pertinent data, and after reading the man his rights, sat down across from him. For the record, please correct me if I'm wrong, Naomasa began. You are one Fuji Nao, age 34 and born in the Fukushima ward. You moved here some 7 months ago for work with your wife, who passed away a month ago. Was any of that incorrect? What does it matter? The man sounded sad, bitter, and defeated. You're just going to throw me away in jail as another villain anyways. Take my daughters away to go into some system. Izuku spoke up now, his voice soft and comforting, inviting the man to look at him and trust what he was saying to him. Mr. Fuji, like I told you back at the deli, you are in trouble, but not to the degree that you seem to think you are. We're simply trying to ascertain the exact events of what went down for the police record. Detective Tsukauchi here is very good at telling if you're lying, and will be able to tell that you are giving an accurate account of what happened." The man's head jerked up at Izuku's voice. His mouth hung open for a second before stuttering out a surprised croak that it was him. "Why would you go this far to help me? I tried to rob that store. I shot you." "Did you mean to shoot me? Did you mean for anyone to get injured at any point during your actions?" Izuku pressed the man now, and Naomasa allowed him to take the lead. If the man was willing to cooperate with Izuku, then he would gladly be sidelined and verify the information. "Of course not. God, no," the man choked out. "I never intended to even fire the weapon. I was going to give it over to you before that man punched me." The man returned his head to his hands before croaking out. "I just wanted to get enough money to feed my kids." Naomasa nodded his head and gave the camera the signal that everything that had been said was the truth, then tapped Izuku in a signal to continue. And continue, Izuku did. By the end of an exhausting half-an-hour interview, Izuku had grilled the man from every angle Tsukauchi could think of, and then some. Where the hell had he learned how to do that was beyond him, but it was more than evident to himself and everyone involved by this point that the man was just as much a victim as everyone else. There was a quick rap at the door before a tall woman in her mid-30s came through. She was all business from head to toe, and both her wardrobe and demeanor showed it. "Hello, Mr. Fuji. My name is Miyakimi, and I'm one of the assistant prosecutors of this area's local prosecutor's office. Contrary to popular belief, not every villain caught by our illustrious heroes is the same. That's where our local police department comes in to weed out the cases actually worth the time and effort to prosecute." Izuku quirked his eyebrow and looked over to the detective. Naomasa only gave a small smirk. "Right now, as it stands, you would be charged with attempted robbery with a deadly weapon. This will confer onto you a minimum sentence of 16 months plus any time you would await trial." Fuji's face drained of blood as his life flashed before his eyes. Mia sighed, toning down the aggressive tone. "That being said, I'm going to offer you an alternative option. In all honesty, this is not a case I'm willing to bet anyone in this room has any interest in prosecuting. This is your first offense, and as such, the court is willing to offer you a 16-month probation instead. You will be assigned a position with one of the several companies we have an agreement with. Should you be fired, you don't check in with your probation officer accordingly or perform some other action to violate the terms of your agreement I'm going to outline for you, then you'll be immediately remanded into police custody to await trial for these charges, as well as any additional ones that may be brought against you." As the prosecutor continued her explanation, Izuku and the detective slipped out from the interrogation room and back into Naomasa's office. Both sighed, one happy with the outcome of the day's work, the other knowing that this was just the start to his night. Izuku spoke up then. "I do believe that completes my role in this, yes? If it's all right with you, I have a very worried mother back at home and would like to get back to her. If for some reason you need to get into contact with me or wanting to request assistance, you can reach me here." Izuku handed Naomasa a piece of paper that had come from the desk, with his contact information on it. "Yes, it does. Thank you for your assistance in this matter, as well as the insights on the case that I'm working on." He gestured to the board with all of the photos. "Your help in these matters has been invaluable." Izuku laid in bed that night with images flashing across the back of his eyes, variations of what could have happened that day. If he hadn't been able to talk the man down, if he had had to hurt him, or worse, to stop someone else from getting injured. The image of Jiro bleeding out of the concrete flashed unbidden to his mind. He hissed and sat up, rubbing his eyes. There hadn't been anything they could do about Death Arms outside of submitting a complaint to the Hero Commission, for all the good that would do. He was tired, but he didn't know enough to satiate the feeling lurking in the back of his gut. He needed an information network in place. He needed to make sure he could at least reasonably see these things coming in the future, and for that, he needed to get back to work. So he did what he did best. He slid out of bed, situated himself in front of his computer with some coffee, and got to work. All right, listeners, this concludes Chapter 6 of Verdant Revolution. Chapter 7 will be up next. I hope you all are still enjoying this one. I really like the partnership with Naomasa and Izuku in this one. I think it was really well done for the author, and the fact that Naomasa's got his quirk and he showed up on scene, I just thought it just worked out really well in that case. Let me know your thoughts and reactions, though, and as always, thank you so much for listening.